Good afternoon, and I'm going to read from another one of my pamphlets. This one's longer. It's about 90 pages, or rather 97 pages. And I published it in 2018, again from Lulu, to suggest that what the working people of this great country needs is their own parliamentary chamber. Parliament then, and I expect it still is now, is dominated by very, very rich people. Something like 77% of MPs have directorships or connections or places on senior management in industry, and a lot of them are millionaires. So, they passed legislation which benefit millionaire industrialists like them. Nobody else. Not the small businessman, not the lower middle class, and certainly not the working class. And they're keen to cut welfare benefits because people on benefits are undeserving because they don't work. That seems to be the attitude, and you find it from the Conservatives to the Lib Dems, the Orange Book Lib Dems, and Starmer and New Labour. Now, this was written a few years before Starmer took over the leadership of the Labour Party, and I don't think he'd want anything to do with it, and I'm very certain our political and industrial elite wouldn't. But nevertheless, the institutions that should be giving working people a voice aren't doing so, and they need to be given a voice. And the only voice, I think, and the only platform on which I think a working class voice can be heard will be a separate parliamentary chamber, and the unions. But the unions are forever under attack. So, here's my blurb. For Workers' Chamber argues that a special representative chamber composed of representatives of the working class, elected by the working class, is necessary to counter the domination of Parliament by millionaires and the heads of industries. It raises the idea of workers' special legislative assemblies from Robert Owen's Grand Consolidated Trade Union, anarchism, syndicalism, guild socialism, the workers', soldiers and peasants' councils in revolutionary Russia, Germany and Austria, the Utopian Socialism of Saint-Simon, and the corporativism of Fascist Italy. It also discusses the liberal forms of corporativism which emerged in Britain during the First and Second World Wars, as well as a system of workers' control and producers' chambers in Tito's Yugoslavia. It argues that parliamentary democracy should not be abandoned, but needs to be expanded to include a workers' chamber to make it more representative. Right. Chapter 1. This is an attempt to argue for a workers' chamber in Parliament, in which the working class will be represented according to the industries and economic organisations in which they worked. This would also include representation for unwaged groups such as carers, the disabled, and the unemployed. At the moment, these groups are not adequately represented by our politicians. In the case of the unemployed, who are the victims of the periodic crisis thrown up by capitalism ever since its emergence as the dominant economic system in Europe since the 16th century, they are actively demonised by politicians, broadcasting and the press as scourgers and social parasites. Not only are the British working class not adequately represented in liberal parliamentary democracy, in the case of the unemployed, they are being increasingly marginalised and exploited. For them, the need of specific parliamentary representation is particularly acute. The goal is not to replace parliamentary democracy altogether, but to make it more genuinely representative of working class interests. Representative democracy, in which the sovereign people elect their representatives to Parliament, has worked well in allowing unpopular governments to be voted out, and more popular politicians and policies voted in and adopted. It has preserved popular government and personal freedom against the highly authoritarian political systems of either the fascist right or communist left. However, recent developments in which Parliament and political parties have become dominated by powerful big businesses, such as the banks, multinational industry, and large supermarket chains such as Sainsbury's, to the exclusion of the working class, has demonstrated the increasing validity of the Marxist view of the state and its organs as instruments of class rule. The abolition of Parliament and its replacement with an assembly elected by and for the workers has a long history in working class politics. It was one of the aims of Robert Owen's Grand Consolidated Trade Union in the 1830s, for example. During the 1917 Russian Revolution, it produced the Soviets, the system of workers, peasants and soldiers' councils, which acted as a parallel and genuinely popular system of government in which the working class elected their representatives and debated the pressing issues of the revolution. At roughly the same time, the British socialist G.H. Cole and his fellows formed and promoted the idea of guild socialism. This was a peculiarly British form of syndicalism. This is a form of anarchism and socialism in which the state is abolished and the management of industry taken over by trade unions. It emerged in the 19th century through the influence of the anarchists P.J. Proudhon in France and Mikhail Bakunin in Russia. It was famously put into practice in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, before being crushed by Franco's Falange. Guild socialism argued for the retention of the state, but as with syndicalism, industry would be taken over and managed by trade unions. There would also be a public authority to represent the consumers, and Parliament would be reconstituted as an industrial assembly in which the representatives of the unions would meet and debate. It would be rather like the British TUC, but with all the powers of parliamentary assemblies. Both syndicalism and guild socialism advises that all, or nearly all, industries would be taken over by the workers and socialised. There are, however, certain parts of the economy that are more suitable to private ownership and management. In the former Soviet Union, for example, the vast majority of food was produced in the private plots held by the workers on the collective farms. In communist Yugoslavia, farming was left in private hands and the state only nationalised enterprises employing more than 20 workers. Moreover, Tony Crosland, the leading ideologue of post-war social democracy in England, argued in his books The Future of Socialism and The Conservative Enemy that it was possible to have the benefits of nationalisation without taking enterprises into public ownership. Nevertheless, the workers in these industries should still have the right to be represented in management and make their voices heard in a workers' parliament. He didn't say that, I did. The scheme is similar to some of the social democratic experiments in corporativism, in which both workers and employers were brought together to solve industrial problems by the state, which were adopted by a number of Western European countries, including Britain, France, Germany and Austria, during the 1960s and 1970s. This vastly expanded form of corporativism also has very strong similarities to the fascist corporativism, arguably the archetypal form of this type of government, adopted by Mussolini's Italy from the 1920s onwards. This was also partly based on syndicalist ideas, but adapted to private enterprise and the demands of Mussolini's personal totalitarian rule. Fascism, with its militarism, violent intolerance, xenophobia and hostility to women, is here very firmly rejected and opposed. Some of the ideas of the left fascists, such as Ugo Spirito, Sergio Panunzio and Olivetti, who saw the corporative state as expanding popular political involvement, empowering the workers, and in the case of Olivetti, who was opposed to it becoming a police state, will also be examined. These still have some political validity, provided that the totalitarian and oppressive nature of the political system in which they are formulated is opposed and appropriate safeguards against this emergence taken. Now, I wrote this before I became aware that the German government also experimented with a form of corporativism in 1919, which is before Mussolini's seizure of power in 1921. They had an industrial chamber in which representatives of the trade unions and the industrialists met to work out economic policy. It was admired by the Fabian Society at the time, and there is a book, which I should have around here, arguing for it, and for the adoption of such a system in Britain. Parliamentary democracy and its drawbacks. The classic foundation of the liberal theory of parliamentary democracy was laid down in the 17th century by the British philosopher John Locke in his two treatises of government. Locke argued that political authority was based on a social contract, which had been made far back in antiquity. The early human community had surrendered political authority to a leader, in return for his protection. Humans, argued Locke, had innate rights to life, liberty and property, which the ruler was bound to respect. Pardon me. This had been the conceptual basis for theories of government since before Plato. It was also used by the advocates of absolute monarchy. Both liberals and the theorists of absolute monarchy argued that the ruler was the people's representative. Absolute monarchists, however, argued that the contract had been once and forever. It was indissoluble, so the people were duty-bound to obey their king. Liberals like Locke, however, argued that as the people were sovereign, and all authority flowed from them, they had the right to depose unjust rulers and elect their own representatives to Parliament. In the 18th century, this produced various theories of government which celebrated the British Constitution as the most perfect of all forms of government. It was held to contain the best of all other forms of government while containing checks against the abuse of power of each. It had a monarchy, an aristocratic element in the form of the House of Lords. The aristocracy placed a check on the power of the monarchy, while the British Constitution also placed a further check on the powers of the aristocracy with the Democratic Assembly, the House of Commons. This was democracy, but in the classic Aristotelian sense, not the modern use of the term. Political theorists before the rise of the theory of modern democracy in the late 18th and 19th centuries firmly believed that political power should be kept out of the hands of artisans and tradesmen, and placed very firmly in that of legislative gentlemen, who had the time and personal wealth to devote to responsible politics. This was the position adopted by Aristotle in his Politics. Furthermore, they felt democracy as it was associated with community of property. In order to preserve private property in the quasi-feudal social hierarchy, they therefore placed property restrictions on the franchise. Locke himself believed in slavery, and when drawing up the Constitution of Carolina, divided the new colony into estates of different sizes, dubbed baronies and so on, which mirrored the gradations of the contemporary nobility. The insistence of property qualifications was even accepted by the radical democrats of the French Revolution. They divided citizens into active and passive according to their personal wealth. Active citizens were those who possessed the necessary property qualifications to vote and become actively involved in politics. Passive citizens were those too poor to have the franchise, but who nevertheless possessed the same human rights as other citizens. Women were also excluded from the franchise, and it was against this that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley wrote her feminist book, Vindication of the Rights of Woman. This exclusion of the middle and working classes from the franchise began to change in the 19th century, as the vote was gradually extended in Britain to include the middle classes, particularly the new class of wealthy industrialists. Nevertheless, the class basis of the franchise remained and led Marxists and other socialists to see the state as the instrument of class rule and oppression. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels declared that the capitalist state was simply a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Engels explained further that such a state is only the organization with which bourgeois society provides itself in order to maintain the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against encroachments either by the workers or by individual capitalists. Marx and Engels also believed that the state arose to moderate and reconcile class antagonisms. As a result, Lenin declared that, according to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of order which legalizes and perpetrates this oppressing by moderating the conflict between the classes. Engels further stated that, because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which through the medium of the state becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. The ancient and feudal states were organs for the exploitation of the slaves and serfs. Likewise, the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labour by capital. The Communist Manifesto describes the progress of Western society as it passed through feudalism to capitalism and from thence to the emergence of the working class, who would create the next phase of society, socialism, according to the operation of the Hegelian dialectic. This scheme of historical development was followed by Ferdinand Lassalle in his Arbeiterprogramm, Workers' Programme. This traced the development of European society from feudalism, when landed property was the ruling principle, to the development of capitalism and the emergence of the bourgeois conception of the state. This considers the state, in Lassalle's words, as a night watchman, whose whole function consists in preventing robbery and burglary. Its purpose is exclusively to protect the personal freedom of the individual and his property. In Lassalle's time, this was the conception of the state that was realised in France with the electoral law of 30th May 1848. This abolished the universal suffrage and replaced it with a census intended to limit working class representation. Lassalle described this as a bourgeois republic which wanted to impress the stamp of the bourgeoisie, the rule of capital, on the republicanized state. Working and lower middle class radicals like the American revolutionary Tom Paine in the late 18th century and the Chartists in the 19th also demanded the right to vote. But the nascent socialist movement were also aware that this on its own was not sufficient to remove the causes of the suffering and misery endured by the working class during the Industrial Revolution. In 1832, an anonymous article in the Poor Man's Guardian to the working people of England made it clear that the poverty and misery of the working classes was due not to taxation, but to their exclusion from the Houses of Parliament. Their place was dominated by the upper and middle classes, who consequently framed the laws in their favour against the interests of the working class. The nameless author wrote, "I have told you that the evils under which you labour are not produced by taxation. I have shown you that the whole expense of the government, from the king to the common soldier, does not amount to more than 1/2 penny a day upon each individual in the two kingdoms, and that the abolition of the whole government would relieve you to the amount of only that 1/2 penny a day. I have told you that the remote cause of your poverty is your not having seats, personally, in that which ought to be your house, and that you are thereby prevented from assisting, like the land stealers, the merchants, the manufacturers, and the tradesmen, in your own persons to make the laws by which you are governed. And I told you that the immediate cause of your poverty is the exorbitant rents, tithes, interest on money, profits on labour, and profits on trade, which are imposed on you by laws made by the land stealers, merchants, manufacturers, and tradesmen in that house, from which you are excluded, and by which exclusion you are prevented from making laws to regulate your wages. I have told you that the government taxes are only a natural consequence of arising out of the rents, interests, and other profits which are imposed on you. That those taxes are, in short, only a sum of money given to the government to beat and torture you into a submission to those rents, tithes, interest, and profits, by which you are robbed to more than 20 times the amount of those taxes. I have told you these things before, and I tell you the same now, and in so doing I tell you the truth." John Francis Bray, in his 1839 Labour's Wrongs and Labour's Remedy, declared, "The great mass of the productive classes look to universal suffrage or the institutional republic as the grand remedy for their wrongs. But it has been shewn that the wrongs arise from a deeper source than form of government, and that they cannot be removed by any mere governmental change. No simple governmental change can affect the present social system, can alter the relative position of the employer and the employed, can have any influence on inequality of condition. Therefore all such changes are illusionary, however extensive they may appear, and must from their nature be utterly worthless, except insofar as they concern the personal liberty of the governed. Under a state of things like that which now exists, the working classes, no matter what may be their intelligence, or their morality, or their industry, or their political power, are by the very constitution of society and their position in it, doomed and damned to hopeless and irremediable slavery until the end of the world." This is not to say that the early socialists demanded violent revolution. Rather, they advocated a profound reorganization of society to improve the condition of the working classes in order to prevent a revolution and its bloody excesses. They were, however, determined to win the vote and parliamentary power as a way of transforming the existing bourgeois state into one that was run by and for working people. While Marx and Engels did not completely reject overthrowing the existing order through violent revolution, they were appreciative of the benefits of parliamentary democracy and the possibility it gave of carrying through the workers' revolution through peaceful means. In his speech in Amsterdam on the eve of the Hague Conference of the First International, Marx declared, "We do not claim that the means necessary for bringing about this aim, the emancipation of labour, will be the same everywhere. We know that we must take into account of the institutions, customs and traditions of various countries, and we do not deny that there are countries such as the United States and Great Britain, and if I knew your institutions better I should perhaps add Holland, where the workers will be able to achieve their aims by peaceful means. But this is not the case in all countries. It was through parliamentary democracy that the working class was becoming increasingly politicised." Marx stated, "The parliamentary regime lives by discussion. How shall it forbid discussion? Every interest, every social institution is here transformed into general ideas, debated as ideas. How shall any interest, any institution sustain itself above, though, and impose itself as an article of faith? The struggle of the orators on the platform evokes the struggle of the scribblers of the press. The debating club in Parliament is necessarily supplemented by debating clubs in the salons and the pothouses. The representatives who constantly appeal to public opinion give public opinion the right to speak its real mind in petitions. The parliamentary regime leaves everything to the decision of majorities. How shall the great majorities outside Parliament not want to decide? When you play the fiddle at the top of the state, what else is to be expected but that those down below dance?" Marx and Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, also declared that the first stage in the working class revolution is the constitution of the proletariat as the ruling class, the conquest of democracy. As for the dictatorship of the proletariat, rather than being a personal dictatorship, such as that of Lenin in Soviet Russia, Marx used the term to refer to the transitional period between capitalism and communism, when the working class controlled the state. In 1875, Marx wrote, "Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. There corresponds to this also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." Engels further stated that the democratic republic is a specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The working class would achieve their power simply through their numerical superiority over the bourgeoisie. As to the precise form the dictatorship of the proletariat would take, in his introduction to Marx's The Civil War in France, Engels is pointing to the Paris Commune. Marx and Engels celebrated the Paris Commune because, in their view, it was an open society with universal suffrage, freedom of religion, and the separation of church and state, and with a non-militaristic public attitude. Marx stated, "The Commune was formed on the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town responsible, and revocable at short terms. Nothing could be more foreign to the spirit of the Commune than to supersede universal suffrage by hierarchic investiture." As for democratic transparency, he stated that the Commune did not pretend to infallibility, the invariable attribute of all governments of the old stamp. It published its doings and sayings. It initiated the public into all its shortcomings. As for religion, he also stated that the pay of the priest, instead of being extorted by the tax-gatherer, should only depend upon the spontaneous action of the parishioners' religious instincts. Its opposition to militarism was shown in the way it hauled down the Vendôme column as a colossal symbol of martial glory. And that concludes the reading for today. Thank you for listening.